he fired us from the project. It was like my identity was stripped away. When your identity gets stripped away, then you kind of have to look around and see what is there to hold on to. It was during that moment that I kind of understood the gospel and Jesus. And so that became my identity. Hi, I'm Bani, and welcome back to the Soul Podcast. When I was growing up, I didn't really think it was important to know where you came from. I think the best way to describe it is I was a third culture kid, if that makes sense. If you were to ask me what my hometown is or where I grew up, that's a hard question to ask because my family was always moving all over the place during my childhood. I was born in Australia, and then I grew up for a time in Cagayan de Oro, in Mindanao, and then we moved to Quezon City, Manila, and then when I was 9 years old, we moved to California, and then so when we finally moved to America, I remember living in about 25 different apartments and houses while I was growing up. So I guess because of that experience when I was growing up, I didn't really think it was important that you knew where you came from because I didn't know where I came from. I came from all over the place. What was more important to me was that you understood where you were going. I was more concerned about my future, about building something new, something for myself. I was really detached from anything in the past when I was growing up. And so because I had that mentality of building something new for myself, that's when I decided to attach my identity to something that I'm good at, which is I discovered as I grew up was storytelling, filmmaking, um, creative things like that. I discovered that talent around high school, the filmmaking specifically. Um, it was a way for me to connect to people, just kind of recording things happening around my life and then creating documentaries, creating stories about that. Um, People liked seeing what I created, and I guess it came to a point where I got good enough to make it a career out of my out of that gift because I had no past identity that I would hold on to because of my constant moving around when I was a kid. That was my identity, which is filmmaking. Fast forward to when I was in college, I decided to go to film school in the Philippines, just because when I was growing up in America, there wasn't a time where I went on vacation to go back to my homeland or anything. I just thought, since I'm done with high school, maybe now that I have this opportunity to take my journey somewhere else, that I'd take my college education in the Philippines. And so there was a film school in Cebu called the International Academy of Film and Television that my mom found for me. That's where I went for my post high school education, and that's also where I met my wife. Yeah, that was actually my first experience reintroducing myself to my home culture, I guess, which is my Filipino identity, which, like I've said, is wasn't really something important for me. In living in America, I identified more just Asian American in general rather than Filipino American. A large part of the reason probably because my friends and my community were was a diverse group of Asian immigrants. So yeah, I went back to the Philippines for college, for film school. Met my wife and got reintroduced to the Filipino culture. But it wasn't like there was a transformation that happened with me at that time, where I suddenly realized, like, oh, the, being Filipino is such a big part of me. I don't think it happened there just yet. It was I was there solely to learn more about filmmaking, hone my skills, And so that's what I did. Fortunately, my wife that I met in film school, my she's a descendant of a World War II hero, her grandfather. And because of that, her dad, Lucky Guillermo, he's actually a World War II documentary filmmaker. So she comes from this line of filmmakers and storytellers and heroes. Um, and for me, the types of stories that I was drawn to are just stories that are that have a lot to do with good versus evil. You know, maybe it's just because I'm a guy, and that's the type of stories that I like hearing about. Um, Lord of the Rings, and those kinds of stories. During my childhood, my dad was a pastor, and so I would hear a lot of Bible stories, and that's generally what stories in the Bible are about. That dichotomy of good and evil and morality and all of those things. And so I got drawn to my wife's dad's work, which was telling stories of Filipino heroes and veterans during World War II. So when we graduated, that's long story short, that's kind of where our film career, the direction that we took was we started helping my dad, which would eventually become my father-in-law, with creating these World War II documentaries about Filipino heroes. And that work was important because I learned that here in the Philippines, the way that history is usually told is through the lens of other cultures, other perspectives other than the Filipinos, especially during that time around the early 2010s. Yeah, there was a sense of correcting the perspectives of history when we were doing that kind of work, and I learned very quickly how to look at history and figure out how to tell the stories of our past in the best way that can be inspiring for the people who we are making it for, which is for the youth of the Philippines at that time. So that's kind of how my filmmaking career began. We made our first World War II documentary film about the Battle of Manila in 1945. It's a very devastating part of our history. A lot of atrocities and war crimes were committed, and it's actually a very depressing film. My very first documentary. When a lot of people saw it when we premiered it at the National Museum in 2015, people came up to us and told us that they liked the direction and the way we told the story, but why not, instead of focusing on the atrocities and the suffering that happened in the past, why not tell stories about our heroes, of the victories that happened during World War II? Because a lot of the times when people think of Philippines and World War II, the first thing that most people think of is the Bataan Death March, which is like it's a part of our history where we lost, right? I mean, it's called the Bataan Death March. Yeah, a lot of people came up to us after our first movie and asked us, why not focus on the victories instead of the losses? So that's what we did for our second film. It's called Unsurrendered 2, and we decided to focus on this group of young Filipinos who were no older than 17, 18, 19 years old when the war began, and they banded together as volunteers to fight against the Japanese during World War II. And even up to now, that's our most successful World War II documentary. People, schools and universities, teachers, professors still use that film in their classes to share that story of victory. So from that point on, that was kind of the style and the message of the films that my wife and I would create and produce, focusing on stories of the past where our ancestors were demonstrating greatness and victory, and just exemplifying that Bayani spirit that we believe exists within every Filipino, and that same spirit still lives within the generations of today. When I was working on the World War II films with Mai and my father-in-law, prior to that, like I said, being Filipino really didn't mean much to me. Um, in America, we're just known as people who are good at singing and nursing and caregiving, dancing. We have a really famous boxer who people, you know, really love watching. That's basically what Filipino is for me growing up. And so when I started working on these documentaries with my wife and my father-in-law, it really fleshed out that Filipino identity even more. I learned to look at my culture and my identity as more than the surface level things that I knew from the past. I was able to um, interview real heroes, real Bayanis, through these documentaries. And when I would speak to them, they really spoke with such a selflessness. They fought for the country, really not for anything for themselves, but they just really loved their families, they loved their friends, they loved the Philippines. What I learned is the Bayani spirit, being a Bayani. That word Bayani, it, often it's translated to hero, um, but it has a deeper cultural meaning. It's more than a hero. It's someone who more than just fights for others. Uh, it's someone who is a warrior for other people, who leads with love, expecting nothing in return. Something interesting I learned while working on the Filipino story is the word bayanihan. Oftentimes, a lot of people say comes from the word bayan, but if we look at how our language evolved over time, bayanihan actually doesn't come from bayan. It comes from bayani. Bayanihan means bayanis being bayanis to each other. And to me, that's like a core value of being a Filipino, to be heroes to one another, expecting nothing in return. That was the spirit that our World War II veterans, our World War II heroes fought with. Um, During that dark period in our history, they fought with the spirit of bayanihan. And it's that same spirit that keeps us going even to this day, right? Through any challenge that we go through, even today, whether it's natural disasters um, or anything that we're facing, somehow that spirit of bayanihan helps us overcome struggles and challenges, and that's, I think, the most profound thing that impacted me while I was working on those World War II documentaries with my family, and how my understanding of the Filipino identity grew even deeper. That's how our filmmaking career took off. The Filipino Story was something that was pitched to us by a Filipino-American businessman during the pandemic. Everything was shut down. All our other projects, World War II films, were canceled or were delayed. We were glad that there was this new project that came to us that would allow us to keep on making films about things that we were good at. We decided to take on this project, uh, and also during this time, my mom told me to go back to America. It was a pandemic. We didn't know what was going to happen in the future, and because I had like these really complicated immigration issues in America. Basically, my wife and I during the pandemic had to move back to America during that time, and it was kind of everything was kind of falling into place because the Filipino story is an animated series that we could create remotely. Yeah, towards the end of 2020, um, my wife and I moved back to California. Now, in the middle of creating the first episode of the Filipino Story, our executive producer, his name's Tony, decided to change the direction of this project that he wanted to create because we were giving him storyboards. I was showing him the script that I was writing, and he felt like he wanted to create something more dynamic, more like the Marvel movies that were coming out during that time. And my style of filmmaking, it wasn't that. I make World War II history documentaries, and so when I was writing the first versions of the Filipino Story, uh, it was kind of with the same style as the documentaries that my wife and I made in the past. When we moved to America, our expectation was the Filipino Story would sustain us during the time that we were living there. But all of a sudden, there was this curveball that Tony threw at us, um, where he wanted to take that project in a different direction. So essentially, he fired us from the project to bring in a different director who worked in Marvel projects and stuff like that, so that the Filipino Story would go in that direction instead. And so for me, as someone who really placed his identity in filmmaking and how good I was at making films and storytelling, it was a devastating um, event that happened. I built my whole life uh, according to this career that I centered all my focus and passion and effort into. I married a filmmaker. Who My father-in-law is a filmmaker, so like my whole world revolved around filmmaking and storytelling, and then all of a sudden to tell me that I'm not good enough and to fire me, and especially during this time period where my wife and I had just moved to a new place where we had no connections, and so to get fired from a project, it was it was definitely something that rocked our world and kind of broke everything down. It was like my identity was stripped away, and when your identity gets stripped away, then you kind of have to look around and see what is there to hold on to, so that you don't you know lose yourself too much. And so for me, because I have that childhood of having a dad who was a pastor, I look back into that part of my life, into my faith, which kind of was set aside when I went on this quest of building a identity for myself as a filmmaker. So I look back at that, and looking back at the Bible and the scriptures, and now looking at it with the lens of someone who knows how to look at history and analyze history. It was during that moment that I kind of understood the gospel and Jesus and that story that was being told in the Bible, uh, through a more real historic perspective. So it was like Jesus revealed himself to me, more real than ever before, because I was looking at his historically this time. This was actually someone who did actually live and die and resurrect, and the historical evidence for this story is oftentimes even more than the evidence of some of the stories that I was telling from my World War II documentaries in the past. And so that became my identity, from someone who latched on to my identity as a filmmaker to someone who put his identity on Jesus. Because of this new identity, that I realized the importance of knowing where you came from, because in the Bible there's an importance that is placed on that truth. You know, it lists down Jesus' genealogy, and so for me, I became more interested in where I came from, to no longer put so much focus on building a new path all on my own, but understanding that, I have ancestors, I have a place where I came from, and some of the habits and the things that I inherited from the people from my past be it may not be good, or uh, it may be things that hinder me today, but there's also greatness that I've inherited from my ancestors as well. I realized the importance of knowing where you came from. But still, my wife and I were fired from the Filipino Story. We had no job, so we had to look for a, a different job in America while we were kind of floating in our filmmaking career. We did have a contract that we had to fulfill with the Filipino Story, which is to finish the first episode, um, because it wasn't quite done yet. When we got fired, we were in the middle of finishing episode one, and so we still had to we wanted to fulfill that contract, just to maintain the professionalism and everything. So we finished episode one, as we worked as grocery delivery workers during the day in California. We I would work on the first episode of the animated series at night, and eventually I finished it, submitted it to Tony, and that was that. My wife and I continued on with our lives, um, and there was this new sense of fulfillment, uh, with with the new rhythm of what we were doing, just delivering groceries every day, because we didn't have any connections at that time in America for to rebuild our filmmaking career. So one day, as the sun was setting, as we just had finished work, I just prayed a quick prayer to God. I said, "You know what, God? If I'm never gonna be a filmmaker again, if I'm never gonna direct another video or film or movie or documentary, then you know what? It's fine. I surrender that identity. As long as you're always gonna be with us, then that's okay." And so I prayed that quick prayer because I was just so fulfilled, having fun with my wife, delivering groceries. And then 5 minutes later, when I prayed that prayer, Tony emailed us after watching the episode that we submitted, and he said that he wants us back to finish the Filipino Story animated series. And he was wrong for firing us, for taking it in a direction that was commercialized. He felt the heart of the video, that of the episode that we created, and he wanted us back on the project no matter what it takes. Yeah, that's why I firmly believe that one of the greatest stories that people should understand about themselves is a story of where they came from, because God all created us for a specific purpose. We're born for a specific reason, during a specific time in history, to do something specific. And so, if you're Filipino, then you're born Filipino for a reason. And I don't think a lot of us understand that yet. Only 3 out of 10 Filipinos are proud of who they are. And so that's why we create the projects that we do. Now, that's the reason now, compared to before, where it was all self fulfillment and building my identity as a filmmaker. Now it's to remind people that you're born Filipino for a purpose. And that's what I want people to realize when they watch the videos that we create. For me, to be Filipino is to be a part of a people who have a history of greatness. And that greatness is defined by how we treat each other. And how we treat each other is through this core value that we know as kapwa. Kapwa means to see ourselves in each other. That's kind of the recurring value that I see ever since, even with the World War II documentaries up until now, with the stories that we tell through the Filipino story, this core value of kapwa is something that pops out through every time period, every location in the Philippines, and even outside in the diaspora. It's this core value of kapwa that we're so curious about, why it's so powerful. And I think that's what defines being Filipino. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for listening. I hope you guys enjoyed listening to my story of how I came from this lost person who didn't understand why it's important to be Filipino to someone who now truly understands that it is an important part of who we are. And I hope to see you guys again next week, where I will talk about more things about the Filipino story. Thank you guys so much for listening.